Okay, so first, what is the topic? Topic is causal finitism. The thesis of it is that nothing can have an infinite causal history. What's a causal history? It's everything that's causally prior to something, an event, an object, something like that. What is called priority? It's a transitive closure of partial causation. What is partial causation? I have no idea. Okay, so the argument for causal finitism, I think the best one is a cumulative case. It's got a whole bunch of sections to it, which fits with our intuitions about the viciousness of causal chains. It solves the problem of non-standard proofs, non-standard numbers in the philosophy of mathematics. It destroys a bunch of supertask paradoxes, a bunch of epistemic rationality paradoxes, a bunch of pragmatic rationality paradoxes, and don't they talk about everything. So start with vicious regresses. This is like sort of very sort of simple stuff, right? So we have the great big pre-Socratic problem, the big scientific problem, why the earth doesn't fall down, because after all, you know, all the massive earthy stuff goes down. And the earth is made of massive earthy stuff. So it should go down, right? Well, you might suppose it's on a pivot. The earth is held up by something. But then you have the same question about the thing that holds it up. And you might wonder, well, why don't you just suppose a regress? But of course, a regress just doesn't seem the right thing here. Generalize from this old story, right? Backwards causal regresses just seem paradoxical. I mean, they seem paradoxical to everybody, I think, who can get used to them. I mean, there were a number of years in my life when I was kind of okay with just a little bit of discomfort when I thought about free will in connection with them. But there's something uncomfortable, something seems a little paradoxical about them, and causal finitism, if true, explains what's wrong with them, right? They're just impossible. It's not the only solution to the problem of, you know, the paradox, to the paradoxicality of backwards causal regress. And you could say, no, they're actually possible. It's just that when they happen, they don't explain. Or they're not enough to explain the thing on top. So the earth could be held on an infinite sequence of turtles, but then it wouldn't be explained why it doesn't fall down. But it's okay, it's still possible. Still, I think it's impossible is kind of satisfying. It lets you embrace Hume's explanatory principle. So Hume had this nice principle that says that if you explain every item in a set, you explain all the items in a set. In an infinite regress, you explain every item. So by Hume's principle, you should be able to explain all the items in a set. And in causal finitism lets you say, yeah, right, because you can't have, the only exception to this would be an infinite chain, and you can't have infinite chains, so, okay. Now the sort of more technical thing, the math stuff. So we have this question, what are the natural numbers, right? And before Gödel, people try to characterize them by giving axioms, right? So you get a bunch of axioms of arithmetic and you hope they'll tell us what the natural numbers are. Well, we now know from Gödel that recursive and sufficiently rich axioms of arithmetic, if consistent, are incomplete. Mainly, there's got to be some arithmetical proposition, and it's going to be of the form, there's a number n such as f of n, where f has only value quantifiers. There's some arithmetical proposition like that. That's true in some models of arithmetic and false in others. What's a model of arithmetic? It's some kind of abstract structure that, you know, fulfills the axioms of arithmetic. So however many axioms you put in, there's going to be still some things that are going to be true in some models and false in others. So it seems like you can't determine by just giving a bunch of statements which model we mean, and hence we can't tell which natural numbers we mean. So what? I mean, maybe that's not a big deal. I mean, if natural numbers maybe are not quite that important. But also, interestingly enough, it falls from the Gödel encoding system that Well, let me just put it this way, that the same thing comes, so this was about arithmetical propositions. There exists an n such that f of n. You can do exactly the same thing for propositions about logical consequence, okay, or provability. So you can, so take propositions of the form P can be proved from Q, or P cannot be proved from Q. It turns out that which of these statements is true also depends on which model of the natural numbers you take. You say, well, what's this got to do with natural numbers? I mean, this is a statement about proofs, not about natural numbers. But any proof can be encoded as a sequence of numbers, right? Just computers do it all the time. Whenever you write a proof on a computer, it's encoded as a sequence of numbers, right? In fact, zeros and ones. So it turns out that the statement that there is a proof from this to this is just an arithmetical statement. This is one of Gödel's insights. I don't know if it's actually original to Gödel. I think maybe not. It turns out in some cases, it depends whether this can be proved from this depends on what natural numbers are, maybe on which model you take. So it actually depends on what axioms are true, what follows from what. Not what follows from the axioms. Obviously, what axioms you assume affects what follows from those axioms. But no, what follows from a fixed axiom sometimes depends on what axioms are true, because the axioms describe sequence is of numbers which encode proofs. So that means the logic itself varies between models of arithmetic. Roughly speaking, what happens is that you can have these what are called non-standard models of arithmetic, in which some things count as finite, that from sort of the intuitive point of view are actually infinite, and you can generate infinite proofs from our point of view, but according to the model, they're actually finite, and prove things that can't otherwise be proved. And this is that's a bad thing, I think. Those are kind of shady proofs. So we want to pick out an objectively right model of arithmetic, which is basically the same as picking out the objectively right account of what is finite. And causal finitism gives you an interesting solution to this. What is it to give the right kind of model of natural numbers? It is to give the causally counting numbers, namely the numbers that could be possibly causally counted. What's causal counting? Is you count 0, 1, 2, 3, but each time you count, it causally depends on what you said before. So you say 3 because you said 2, you say 5 because you said 4. Causal finitism ensures that anything you can get to by causal counting is finite. And so it picks out a privileged model. Okay, maybe there's some other solutions that probably there are, but this is a nice one. The thing in the title of this topic, right, or Grim Reapers. Right, so they're for those who haven't seen this before, just need a reminder. So the idea is we've got these Grim Reapers, and we've got all kinds of variants of it. Let's just suppose there's Fred here. He's alive at 10 a.m. and if each Grim Reaper wakes up at a certain amount of time to the power minus n hours after 10 o'clock. So one at 10:30, one at 10:15, one at 10:07.5, and so on, going half and half. And each Grim Reaper has this power, this interesting causal power to look at Fred and kill Fred if and only if Fred is alive. And this is, of course, paradoxical because, well, it's guaranteed that at 11 o'clock Fred is going to be dead, right? But if he's going to be dead, it seems like he has to have been killed by one of the Reapers. Those are the only things in the situation that are able to kill him. So one of the Reapers must have killed him. But which one? Well, let's imagine it's the 10:15 one. Well, could it have been the 10:15 one? No, because you can't kill somebody who's dead. So the 10:15 one killed him. Fred must have been alive there. If he was alive here, he must have been alive at 10:07.5. And if he was alive then the 10:07.5 Grim Reaper would have already killed him. And since before every Reaper, there's an earlier one. None of the Reapers could have killed Fred, and yet Fred is dead. Yeah, but you could say, here's a simpler. So what's wrong with this? I say causal finitism says, well, you've got like these infinitely many causal influences on what happens to Fred by 11 o'clock. But here's another story. The unsatisfiable pair objection. You just say, the story Alex just gave is logically impossible, and Alex agrees. Oh, and that's why it's impossible. Didn't you say it was logically impossible? So it's impossible. Very nice little explanation. I'm not sure, but let's try a variant. This is a funner one. Instead of killing, let's just, you could do this one with killing too, maybe, but it's more fun with toe cutting. So the Green Reaper just cuts off Fred's toe if and only if Fred has 10 toes. Now let's do a bit of logic too. Run exactly the same argument as before. What follows? What follows is that if you set up this scenario of the infinitely many toe cutters, then Fred's toes regrow within the hour, infinitely many times. Right? Because if they don't regrow, then we have a logical contradiction. That was the observation of the previous one, right? One of them, they had killed Fred, blah, 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 but it couldn't have been any of them. One of them would have had to cut off Fred's toe. None of them could have done it. Well, there's a way out. One of the toes must have regrown. And we just have a logically valid argument that in this setup, one of the toes would be regrow. This seems really weird. Now, there's no contradiction biting a bullet. So this is a set, when you set up these Green Reapers and set their times like this, you automatically get toe regrowth, but it's very strange. Okay, one more fun thing. This is a little different. So let's imagine a stack of cards, each one of one with for each number, 1, 2, 3, and so on, extending infinitely far down. Right? So a big stack of cards, and they're all perfectly shuffled. How do we shuffle them? Well, here's how we did it. N days ago, we shuffled the top N cards. Because you might wonder how you shuffle infinitely many cards. That's not easy. But you could shuffle any finite number of cards. They're easy. You imagine the processes for doing that. So N days ago, shuffled the top N cards. So all the cards are shuffled now. Okay, you and I take a card each off the top. And if you get the bigger number, you will win $100. Okay, I ask you, do you want to play this game with me? And you say, well, I guess it's just winning. That's fine. So I say, okay, but will you pay me something to play this game? Yeah, I'd pay you. How much would you pay me? Pay me $45. Yeah, because you think, look, my cards got a 50% chance of being bigger than your card. The price is $100. $45 is worth playing the game. So, okay, you say, yeah, I'll pay you $45 to play. Okay, so now we start playing. I pull out my card, you pull out your card, we look at our cards, and we each pale in fear because we realize that the other person must have a bigger card. Well, not must, but almost sure he does. Why? Because there are infinitely many cards that have a bigger number and only finitely many that have a smaller number than the one I'm looking at. And the same is true for yours. So you're almost certain that I have a bigger card, and I'm almost certain that you got a bigger card, but I'm the one who runs the game, so I'm going to offer you a deal. You're almost certain that my card has a bigger number. So if you pay me $95, I'll give you my card, and you can give me yours. And we can repeat this game. And each time we do this, you will lose at least $40 because you'll pay $45 to play the game and $95 to swap. Because after all, $95 is worth paying for almost certainty of getting 100. Let's skip the second one. You could still vary in on this. You could just say the usual, this is not causal finitism kills this because you say you can't do this causal process where the current shuffling of the cards is the result of infinitely many shuffles. So you cannot have it produce this well-shuffled deck like that. Okay, it's not the only way out. Another way out is just to say, the usual rules of rationality just don't apply to these kinds of infinitary situations. And that's certainly an available option. So each of these problems has solutions other than causal finitism, but there's a cost to each of the solutions other than causal finitism. There's a cost to causal finitism too. I was very unhappy when I first realized, when it first came to me that maybe infinite regresses are impossible, and had for years just thought it was a disgusting idea to think that they can't be that. I was just kind of disgusted by Hilbert's hotels type arguments and things like that. And then I came across these other arguments, and I wasn't happy. There's a cost. For me, it was counterintuitive. There's a cost to each solution. There's a cost to causal finitism. But if you pay the cost of causal finitism, you solve all the problems at once at one price. You pay the cost of the others. For each one, you pay a different cost. You pay a different price. So on the whole, I kind of think causal finitism is cheaper than paying the separate price for each one. Furthermore, and this is, even if there is another solution to a problem, if the other solution is not in tension with causal finitism, and the other solution is not certain, we get some evidence for causal finitism. It's sort of a general kind of observation about how evidence works, is that even when you have an alternate explanation to something, as long as the two are not in tension, you can say you get evidence for both. Thank you.
So I want to share a little bit about my own story of thinking about this topic and kind of where I'm at right now. So like Alex, I wouldn't say disgusted by pizzas out, but I liked infinite regresses and I wasn't against that, and I was kind of unsure what to think. One kind of argument that's been given is an argument that on the handout has the following general structure. And this is where I'm interested in understanding the general structure better. And so I'm kind of exploring this. But the general structure of the argument points to something that might be intuitively possible, like an infinite regress, or it's not obviously impossible. Then through some kind of recombination or rearrangement, you can generate a new scenario that is very weird, if not contradictory. So for a while, when I was thinking about the infinite regress, I was familiar with weird scenarios like Hilbert's hotel, where you fill up the hotel, it's completely full, every room is occupied, and then you can make more room for more guests without kicking anybody out. You just have everybody just moves down one. And the hotel didn't increase in size, just everybody come out of the room, go down one and go back in. Now there's a new space. And I thought that was very weird. But I thought maybe that was just a sign of the weirdness of infinity. So infinity is weird, and it shouldn't be surprising if you find out that this weird thing implies other weird things. Until I encountered the Reaper scenario, where it looked like the kind of weirdness that you could get through rearrangements of items is not just weird, but it's contradictory. Which I guess, that is weird. I mean, you could have a contradiction. Theoretically, you could think that there is such a thing, but some people toy with that. But it's so weird that I was like, no, there seems to be a problem. But the problem might be with the recombination principles. So one thing that I noticed about myself, just in my own intellectual journey, is I wasn't really thinking that, hey, if there were an infinite past, maybe there could be an infinite hotel. There could be an infinite past, but there could be a rearrangement of materials to build a hotel. That wasn't, I just found it intuitive that if there could be an infinite past, then there could be an infinite hotel. But then since encountering the bigger Reaper scenario, where the weirdness comes all the way to a contradiction, it caused me to kind of rethink, the recombination principles. And so to help me to think about this, I want to talk about some cases that will help me to think about the structure. So I have some pieces of reality. I was showing these to Joe earlier. These are dangerous pieces of reality. Now, individually, they may seem benign. So on this one, it's a little hard to see, but this one has a sentence that says, there is no true sentence next to this note. Okay? Now, the sentence on this note is true because it says there's no true sentence next to the note, and there's nothing next to it. But I have other sentences. So if this sentence says unicorns roam the earth, I don't know about you guys, but I think that's probably not true. So if I put this false note next to this note, what happens? Well, this one says there's no true sentence, and this one's not a true sentence. So it's still true that there's no true sentence. So the unicorn's one is false, and the one that says there's no true sentence, still true. No problem. Okay, let's do some more experiments here. Here's another note. This one says 2 + 2 = 4. This one I think is true. I think some philosophers of math disagree with that. I think they're all false, but assume that's true. Then we can falsify this first note by just putting next to it. There's no true note next to it. Well, there is one now. So now this note has become false. We'll pull it away. Okay, so far there's not really a problem. But I said this is dangerous. What I'm doing is very dangerous. I don't recommend you do this at home because I have another note. This note says, and I had to update the note. This note says there is a true sentence next to this note. Okay, now this note, there's a true sentence next to it. This is true when I put the true sentence next to it. False when I don't. But what happens if I put these two notes, the one that says there's no true sentence and the one that says that there is a true sentence, next to each other? What happens when I do that? Well, now you can use reason and logic, and you can investigate this in your mind. We don't even have to perform the experiment. You could deduce that if this note is only true if a non-true note is next to it, then that means that if I put these notes next to it, that this first note, if it's true, then it would have to be not true. If I put this note next to it, you can verify that, think that through. And then if you go the other way, you say, well, this note is not true. Then you can see if it's not true, then that means the note next to it has to be true. In which case, since this note says that the note is true, then if this is not true, this has to be true. Okay, so think it through, and you'll see that we'll have a contradiction. That this note would be true if and only if it's not true, and that's a contradiction. Now from here, you might verify to yourself that it must be impossible to put these notes together, right? But I'll just speak for myself. I have a very strong intuition that it is possible to put those notes together. It's a kind of recombination intuition. And even though the laws of logic tell my mind that there's something problematic, I infer by my very strong intuition of recombination that the problem is not with recombination, it's something else. Okay, now for the empiricists out there, I'm going to now demonstrate for you the possibility of putting these together. Like I said, just don't do this at home. That's okay. All right, we're still here. Before I put those together, you never saw those put together. And yet you were inferred by reason that they could be put together if you had the intuition of recombination. So this convinces me that there are versions of the paradox, a paradox, I should say, where recombination is sort of a guiding light to lead you to see that there is a problem. But the problem is not with recombination, it's with something else. So what is the problem? Well, this is a big topic. What is the problem? This is the topic of the liar paradoxes, where you have something saying that something is not itself true. And this leads to a whole bunch of discussion as to what might be the problem. I have a hypothesis. I call this truth-making hypothesis. This might not be correct, but it's my working hypothesis that would explain where the impossibility lies. So I say the sentence is true if and only if there exists a truth maker for that sentence, or that truth maker, or something in reality that the sentence would correspond to. It exists explanatorily prior to the sentence itself. So the idea is that the sentence is a vehicle for expressing a proposition, and so that vehicle needs to exist to express that proposition. And so one way I sort of think about it, just by analogy, I kind of imagine that when the sentence exists, it expresses the proposition that sends out a radar to investigate reality to see if there's a reality there that the proposition would correspond to. And the reality there will not include the very sentence itself, because it's going to be a prior reality. The truth maker is prior to the truth. Okay. So if that's right, then we can avoid that problem with the liar paradox. There's all sorts of liar paradoxes. I claim that we can avoid a central problem with at least some liar paradoxes. Okay, now what about infinite regresses? I have another scenario here where this scenario allows for the truth-making hypothesis to be true, it still finds an additional problem. I call this infinite liars. And again, my goal is to understand the general structure of these paradoxes. And I feel like I have not reached that level of understanding yet. I'm still trying to understand it better. So I'm trying to work through these cases to see if I can get more clarity on this. So the infinite liars, this is a case where each day from eternity past, a new or refreshed instance of the sentence, there has never been a true sentence, appears. Okay, so let S be, there has never been a true sentence. Clearly, S is false, so there have been true sentences. We've seen some today. But now, let's just imagine a world where from eternity past, new or refreshed instances of S have been appearing one per day. And let's just say in this world there are no other sentences that ever exist. So is any instance of S true? Well, if you sort of think this one through, you can see we have another paradox, because just as in the Grim Reaper paradox, in order for an instance of S to be true, then if you go up to the past, it has to be true that there's never been a true one. But then if there's never been a true one, then the past version of it is not going to be true. And you're going to end up getting the answer that yes, S is true. Yes, an instance of S is true, if and only if not. And here the point is I want to compare the structure of this argument to the structure of the Grim Reapers. So in the Grim Reaper case, an infinite series of Grim Reapers is arranged, each set to kill Fred, let's say, if and only if Fred has not already been killed by an earlier Reaper. And then we can ask the same question, does any Grim Reaper kill Fred? And we have the structurally same problem. Yes, if and only if no. And so I think the general lesson in scenario E with the infinite flyers is the same as the general lesson with the single liar case. The general lesson is just there's some problem with the setup. Right? And what is it? It could be the recombination principle. Maybe that's the problem. The principle of recombination that allows us to go from an infinite chain to an infinite chain where you have instances of this sentence created one per day. But here's an observation. The paradox arises from a setup, from any setup that implements the following condition: X, if and only if not X. And in the liar case, I found a hypothesis that allowed us to avoid the implementation of that condition in the liar case, right? But in the infinite liar case, that hypothesis, the truth-making hypothesis, doesn't by itself get us out of the paradox, doesn't avoid the contradiction. So we need to say something else. Maybe what we should say is that there's a problem with recombination, but just as in the liar case, I have a very strong intuition of some relevant recombination. I come instead to this hypothesis, I call it the infinite root hypothesis. If there can be an infinite regressive events in which each event depends on a prior event, then there can be a setup that implements the paradoxical condition of X, only if not X. There are different versions, as Alex mentioned, are different versions of the Grim Reaper scenario. It can be set up in different ways. But every one of those ways results in a paradox because it implements this condition of X, if only if not X. And so that's my claim. My claim is that if you can have infinite regress, then you can set up the paradox. If that's right, then you can build an argument for causal finitism. And this is the argument that this general structure of argument is what affected my thinking. It goes like this: suppose there could be infinite sequence of causally dependent past events. Then there could be a setup that implements the condition X, if only if not X. That's the infinite root hypothesis. There cannot be such a setup because it entails a contradiction, which is a very weird state of affairs. Therefore, there cannot be an infinite sequence of causally dependent past events. Of course, one could respond to this argument in various ways. In particular, one could respond that the repugnance of the causal finitism is too much of a cost to pay if you have an intuition against it. Or one could argue that the recombination principle that would be required here is not true. But when I think about the structure of the problem, it strikes me that the root of the problem is just whatever it is that generates that condition. And it seems like causal finitism is a good candidate. Thank you.
I do share this repugnance towards causal finitism. I'm not myself a causal finitist. And my goal here is just to explain why I'm not a causal finitist. Perhaps not yet to respond to anything that's been said, but just to offer you a kind of personal confession of why I don't like causal finitism. So I think one of the main motivations for causal finitism comes from Benardete paradoxes, of which the Grim Reaper paradox is one variety. So these paradoxes originate from Jose Benardete in his 1964 book, An Essay in Metaphysics. And it's a family of paradoxes that share a kind of abstract structure, or at least a structure which slightly modifies an abstract structure. The structure involves two conditions, what we can call the unbegun condition, which just says that for some particular infinite set, which is linearly ordered by the abstract before relation, for any x in that set, there is some y before x. So in plain English, the set in question is beginning is. It has no first element. The second condition we can call the at if and only if nowhere before condition, or ANBC, and it says that for any x in the set in question, x satisfies condition phi, if and only if, for every y before x, y fails to satisfy condition phi. To put that in English, that just means that every member of the set is such that phi, if and only if none of the previous members are phi. So like, kill Fred, if and only if none of the previous members kill Fred. As it turns out, these two conditions are provably logically inconsistent. In the Q&A, I'd be happy to walk through and verbally explain the proof. And I will grant that some Benardete paradoxes slightly modify this structure and so aren't themselves strictly inconsistent. They might modify A and B, C to say that each member of the set is such that phi, if and only if some external observable condition holds. But typically to actually get a contradiction as opposed to some odd result, modal space is odd indeed, filled with very strange things that are very far removed from our ordinary humdrum experience. To get a contradiction, we have to add some sort of stipulations to the scenario which actually end up jointly implying A and B, C. And as Alex kind of gestured towards, there are various different versions of Benardete paradoxes. Some stretch out through an infinite past, some stretch out through an infinite future, some are a kind of temporal supertask where you perform infinitely many actions in a finite period of time, some are a spatial supertask where things get ever closer in space, some take place in an infinite space, so imagine each Reaper does something if and only if none of the rightward Reapers do something, and there are infinitely many Reapers in a kind of beginningless sequence in that direction. And there are also abstract versions of the Benardete paradoxes, like Yablo's infinite liar. Okay, so there are two main solutions to the contending, in my view, to Benardete paradoxes. One would be causal finitism, which says that necessarily nothing has infinitely many causes. This means that both infinite regresses and infinite causal cooperation are impossible. And infinite causal cooperation is brought in because it solves some other paradoxes that causal finitism is meant to solve. The second solution is what we can call the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis, or the UPD. This, at least as I characterize it and I defend it, it says that, hey, firstly, those two conditions from earlier are logically unsatisfiable. That's uncontroversial. But moreover, this observation itself diffuses these Benardete paradoxes. No substantive metaphysical hypothesis is needed to solve them. And here I'd like to give an analogy of the kind of taxi analogy. Imagine I get into a taxi. With the taxi driver, I drive around San Francisco. We see the Golden Gate Bridge. We see all these sorts of things. Eventually, I get out of the taxi, and then later that day, an essentially truth-telling God reveals to me that you've never gotten into a taxi. Okay, end of story. So, what should we conclude here? I mean, I just told that kind of paradox, as it were, the taxi paradox. I mean, we can derive a contradiction, because wait, I did, according to the story, I got out of the taxi, and a God revealed to me that I didn't get out of a taxi, and he's essentially truth-telling, and if something is essentially phi, then it's such that phi, and if it's such that phi, then phi, so it must follow that I never actually got into a taxi. So I both got into a taxi, or I both got out of the taxi and never got out of the taxi. Oh my goodness, it's an inconsistent story. Maybe taxis are impossible. Maybe God's impossible. No. I simply told an inconsistent story. We shouldn't solve this paradox by opting for any substantive, controversial metaphysical hypothesis. such as that taxis are impossible, or God is impossible, or God can't reveal that I never got to do a taxi, all we can infer is that the conjunction of the various elements of the story is impossible, but we needn't and shouldn't say any particular conjunct of the story is impossible in order to solve the taxi paradox, and we needn't and shouldn't take on any other substantive metaphysical hypotheses. So we should be basically deflationist about this kind of taxi paradox. I think that's uncontroversial. And the UPDist, the proponent of the unsatisfiable paradiagnosis, essentially says the same thing about Benardete paradoxes. Now, there are maybe slightly modified, more precise formulations of the UPD that I'm toying with a little bit. And maybe I'll just throw one on the table. It's similar to the last sentence of section 2 on the handout. But it essentially said, well, we first introduced the notion of an absurd Benardete paradox, which is a Benardete paradox which is logically or metaphysically impossible. And then the modified UPD would then just roughly be the denial of the claim that there is some substantive or controversial metaphysical thesis T, such that if T were false, then it would be possible for there to be an absurd Benardete paradox. So the UPD is so characterized, rejects that the possibility of an absurd Benardete paradox follows from the rejection of any substantive metaphysical thesis. Okay, so why accept the UPD and have a kind of repugnance towards causal finitism? Well, one reason is that UPD is considerably simpler than causal finitism. UPD has really no substantive metaphysical commitments other than ones shared with causal finitism, like perhaps thinking that contradictions are impossible. By contrast, causal finitism heavily restricts the range of possible kinds of causal structures, debarring both any kind of infinite causal regress and any kind of infinite causal cooperation. Moreover, causal finitism puts, I think, considerable pressure on us to accept an implausible and deeply profligate wide-ranging spatiotemporal finitism, where space and time are discrete, where the past is finite, where space is finite in extent, etc., and this only considerably detracts from the parsimony of causal finitism, but it also introduces lots of new commitments facing lots of potential counterarguments. Now, for some of these, there's not going to be a strict entailment between causal finitism and the relevant theses, but I do think that there's considerable pressure in that direction, and I think various arguments can bring that out, which we can potentially talk about in our open discussion. So that's the first broad kind of reason. I just think the UPD is overwhelmingly simpler. A second reason is that the UPD is a more unifying solution to Benardete paradoxes. And that's roughly because there are non-causal Benardete paradoxes that causal finitism simply cannot solve. And given that these are exactly parallel paradoxes to causal finitism, given that these are exactly parallel paradoxes to causal variance, I take this to be a serious cost of causal finitism. I think these paradoxes should clearly have the same solution. Compare, it's a bad idea to solve Benardete paradoxes by saying that, hey, physical things can't move arbitrarily quickly. And why is that a bad idea? Well, because we could just imagine that the things in question aren't physical. Maybe they're like angelic beings or whatever. So that wouldn't be a good solution to the paradox. Or to Benardete paradoxes more generally. So one way to get a Benardete paradox that's non-causal that's non-causal would be through supposing that it's simply a brute fact about the reapers, that each satisfies the purely truth-functional biconditional of acting if and only if none of the previous reapers act. So this note, you don't have any causal conditions in here, and of course, to kill this paradox, you might add that brute contingent facts like this are impossible, but we're at least starting to notice that now your solution to Benardete paradoxes is starting to become very inelegant, disunified, and disjunctive. There are also non-causal explanatory versions of Benardete paradoxes that appeal to notions like grounding and essence. This is kind of at the edge of my thought. Don't know not fully sold that these succeed, but I think that they're at least reasonably plausible. Here's a grounding version. Grounding can have enabling conditions, which are non-causally explanatorily relevant to grounding facts obtaining. Alex Moran has argued this. Ralph Bader has argued this. Several others have argued this. Now suppose that each reaper grounds something if, but only if, the enabling condition obtains that none of the previous reapers ground that thing, or perhaps a similar kind of thing. Here we get a non-causal Benardete paradox, but we don't have any brute facts. Or, to talk in terms of essence, suppose it lies in the nature of a reaper to satisfy the following biconditional. Bf if and only if no preceding reaper is f. Suppose, however, that there isn't causal sensitivity here. Instead, we have just a kind of essence-based explanation for why this biconditional holds. It's not causal sensitivity to previous reapers. This, too, will allow us to cook up a non-causal Benardete paradox without brute facts. And of course, you might have other objections to these cases. Maybe for the grounding case, you might think, hey, we'll just adopt dependence finitism in addition to causal finitism. So, there can't be something which depends on infinitely many things. Again, you're starting to get disunified, you're starting to get inelegant, but also I just think dependence finitism is not plausible at all. One thing can clearly be grounded in or ontologically depend on infinitely many basing entities. The set of natural numbers depends on infinitely many natural numbers. Arguably, spatial regions depend on infinitely many points. God's act of knowledge depends on infinitely many things known. There are lots of examples of one thing being explanatorily dependent on, though non-causally dependent on, infinitely many basing entities. And finally, there are circular Benardete paradoxes. We can imagine a circular chain of special light bulbs that are sensitive to the states of leftward light bulbs in such a way that each light bulb is on if and only if no light bulb to its left is on. This too can get us a kind of Benardete paradox, but we don't have infinitely many causes here. In fact, we don't even need to specify the scenario in such a way that it involves causation at all. So all in all, I think causal finitism is just like hopeless to kill the full breadth of Benardete paradoxes or Benardete-like paradoxes. Much the same way that like saying, like you can't have physical things that are acting this quickly is kind of hopeless in response to Benardete paradoxes. And I think that's a serious mark against it. So that's the second main reason why I don't like causal finitism. A third main reason is that I just think the UPD better accords with our best modal epistemological tools. Consider three worlds. W1 is a spatially finite Newtonian world, and there's an infinite series of massive particles, each half the mass as the one next to it, and half as spatially distant from it. Each such object exerts some gravitational influence on the rest, and hence infinitely many entities causally impinge on one entity. Now considerable W2. W2 contains an infinite past in which two simple particles revolve around one another for eternity. Also seems to involve infinite causal chains. W3 is very similar to the actual world by stipulation. It has continuous time and a 1 second process of me dropping a pencil that takes place. Furthermore, suppose that each instantaneous state of this process is causally related to the subsequent states of the process, leading to an infinite causal chain. Now, just speaking for myself, each of these worlds seems totally innocuous, like just in terms of my modal intuition, like just as much as it seems totally innocuous to imagine a headless elephant or whatever, it seems each of these seems totally perfectly conceivable, perfectly imaginable, perfectly coherent. Modal intuition seems to support them. Arguably modal uniformity that my two panelists have published on supports them, because each of these worlds seems to me to diverge from either the actual world or some clearly possible world in merely quantitative respects. Some of these things are arguably posited in physically live cosmological models. There are at least some physically live cosmological models that feature an infinite past, for instance, which arguably gives us defeasible grounds to think that there are at least some possible worlds with that. So I think like some of our best modal epistemological tools support at least the possibility of some kinds of either infinite causal cooperation or infinite causal chains. So that's the third reason why I like BUPD over causal finitism. A fourth reason we could call the companions and guilt argument. There are other causation-like dependence relations that can have infinitely many basing entities, or things upon which the relevant thing depends. And I think that gives us reason to think that causal dependence can likewise have infinitely many basing entities. These alternative relations are things like grounding, ontological dependence, and more generally, any kind of explanatory dependence relation, or some kind of dependence relation which backs explanation. These relations are causation-like in that they plausibly share the same formal features as causation, like asymmetry or reflexivity and transitivity. They're explanatory, moreover, or they back explanation. And they in some sense bring about or generate something. Moreover, I think intuitively there seems to be like no relevant difference, at least to me, between causal dependence and non-causal dependence relations, which could explain why it's impossible for the former, but not the latter, to have infinitely many basing entities. And I think, moreover, that whatever makes infinite causal dependence impossible would plausibly be shared by infinite non-causal dependence, too. So here are some cases of infinite basing for causation-like dependence relations. God knows that he knows all truths. Given the transitivity of dependence and the fact that a subject's knowing that P at least partly depends on the fact that P, we have dependence on infinitely many items. God, moreover, is omni-rational, and so if he chooses to actualize some world, he does so on the basis of all the reasons favoring the actualization of that world. Since there are arguably there are infinitely many reasons favoring the actualization of the actual world, namely that, if there's an endless future, the fact that there's going to be like a good day in the future, day number 1. There's going to be another good day in the future, day number 2. There's going to be another good day in the future, day number 3. These are each some weight of a reason to actualize this world. And so I think there are infinitely many reasons favoring the actualization of the world, and God's not going to ignore those reasons in his choice. So I think these reasons partly explain God's awareness of them, or at least partly explain his choice of worlds, leading to dependence on infinitely many items. Likewise, the set of natural numbers depends on infinitely many things. Sets depend on their members. The set of natural numbers has infinitely many members. If space or time is continuous or dense, and if temporal intervals or spatial regions depend on their constituent instants or points, then once again, we have one thing depending on infinitely many things, and so on, and so on. So I think just given that other causation-like dependence relations can have infinitely many basing entities, that gives us reason to think that causal dependence can likewise have infinitely many basing entities. Now again, a natural thought is that, well, hey, none of these are like a linearly ordered chain. Instead, it's like infinite causal cooperation. But those of us who have read Alex's excellent book, Infinity, Causation, and Paradox, the causal finitist needs to bring in needs to debar infinite causal cooperation in order to solve some of these paradoxes that causal finitism is promising to solve. So that's a fourth reason why I think we should be UPDists. A fifth reason is that causal finitism, at least in the absence of strict finitism, is kind of puzzling and seems to proliferate explanatory demands. I mean, after all, we can reasonably wonder, why couldn't infinitely many entities train their powers on a single target, especially if there could be infinitely many concrete entities? And there may be two subpoints here. So like one possible subpoint is that, hey, proof necessities are bad-making features of theories, and it's not clear what explains why necessarily nothing has infinitely many causes. Another potential odd-making feature of this, Alex in his book talks about what's called a prefixed Reaper story as a potential problem for like UPD-like analyses of these situations. But actually, I think we can get prefixed Reaper stories that don't involve infinite causal dependence. Maybe we could talk about that in our panel. So those are, and then the sixth problem would just be maybe like a potential like privileged individuation problem, which is just causal finitism arguably requires us to like give a privileged individuation of causes and effects, which we might find implausible. So imagine an infinitely spatially large universe with infinitely many particles. At least to me, that seems clearly possible. And I think that should be granted by causal finitists who aren't strict finitists, or at least who allow for the possibility of infinitely many concrete entities existing together. I suppose that there's no funny business going on among the particles, right? Like they don't form an infinite causal regress. Universal gravitation doesn't hold. So it's not the case that infinitely many particles causally affect each particle or whatever. So, but suppose that the universe evolves forward from T to T prime. It seems quite plausible that the states of each of the infinitely many particles at T, together with any of their activities between T and T prime, at least are partially causally responsible for the global state of the universe at T prime, in violation of causal finitism. Now, of course, maybe we could say that there is no such global state. I don't know. That doesn't seem terribly plausible. It seems to be arguably a quantification over it. Seems to be indispensable in certain domains of physics. And all I need is like, this is at least a possible world. It's at least possible that there's a global state. Or perhaps the causal finitist could say, well, hey, there is such a state that like global states can only be caused by other global states. So we only ever have one-to-one causation. I don't know, that individuation of causes and effects to me seems arbitrary and implausible. It just seems right to me that the states of the particles at the earlier time are at least partly causally responsible for that particular subsequent global state obtaining. And moreover, this also requires some kind of objectively privileged individuation or demarcation of which things are causes and which are effects. And yet we might find it plausible that there is such an objectively privileged individuation. So those are some of the main reasons why I like the unsatisfied repair diagnosis over causal finitism. I do have things to say with respect to addressing causal finitist arguments. I'll just very briefly say something about the abductive argument that Alex was raising. I actually don't think causal finitism is terribly explanatory or unifying. I suspect most of the paradoxes in question have non-causal versions, and I don't think causal finitism solves infinite lottery type paradoxes. I think I'd like to bring that up perhaps in the Q&A. Smolian's Rod, I also don't think causal finitism has a satisfying unified solution to that. I also think that the general type undeflationary UPD style response solves many of the paradoxes, and if some are left over, then I think it's worth the cost just to take a piecemeal approach to those. I also think causal finitism is very unparsimonious, which is like, not something that we want when we're trying to abductively reason to the best explanation here. And again, causal finitism proliferates explanatory demands, and it raises many explanatory puzzles. So those are some of the main things I'd say with respect to the abductive argument. Now, fleshing all this out would require, explaining why I don't think causal finitism is actually a good solution to these infinite lottery type paradoxes and other paradoxes of rationality. And I'd love to do that on the parent. So that's gonna wrap it up for my little opening spiel. And yeah, thank you.
Maybe I'll throw out something about the explanation of causal finitism, right?
That's good.
Here's kind of how I'm thinking about this. the situation is kind of like that which maybe somebody like Aquinas has with respect to God. He thinks he's got these good arguments for the existence of God, but then, and for the necessary existence of God. And then there's a question, why does God exist? And I think Aquinas' take on it is there is an answer to this. It's just what we don't know, but it's something to do with the nature of God, but a nature that is at least currently beyond us. And I think a similar kind of thing can be said. We've got these good arguments to think that, though of course George thinks they're not good arguments, but I think we've got good arguments to think causal finitism is true. And now why is it true? Well, it's something to do with the nature of causation, I think. But our knowledge of the nature of causation is pretty weak right now. We can say some formal features of it, but what it really is rather mysterious. And this is like not something that, is really much of an argument. But when I think about causation, I can get myself in this frame of mind where I see it's a kind of passing on of something, some kind of, is being passed on. And when I think it that way, it starts to become plausible that just because of its being the kind of thing it is, you can't have infinite chains of it. Now, it doesn't give the infinite cooperation in this kind of intuition. And you get this kind of intuition when you see like Aquinas talking of per se causal regresses. I think the same intuition holds for what he calls the per-accidens ones. But the general point is that we know very little about the nature of causation. We can get some formal properties of it. Let's look at the formal properties too, right? So think of like some of these formal properties. Do we have a good explanation of them? I'm not sure we do. We have intuitions that they hold. But it's just ultimately, that's just the nature, that's the kind of beast causation is. And maybe there is a deep answer once we fully understand causation. We'll see why it can't be, why it's irreflexive, for example. But it's something about its nature, I think. So I think in the end, it's a thesis about the nature of causation.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, one thing is, it's not, in terms of comparing theories, like adverting to, hey, there's something about the nature, but like we don't have any story, we can't really even flesh out how it could potentially go. It's just, it doesn't seem terribly satisfying on the kind of abductive inference front. So that's like one thing that I want to say. But like another thing that I want to say is like with respect to more companions and guilt point, where it seems like, those formal features are also shared by grounding, which can have infinite cooperation. That kind of, you have the oomphy productiveness. Maybe that's not present in grounding, but there is still some kind of derivative passing on of reality.
Yeah.
And that really is what seems to be doing the heavy lifting here. And so if that explanation is present there, it seems like the companions and guilt argument is coming right back in, where it seems like then we shouldn't be able to have infinite cooperation in terms of grounding. But I think clearly that's mistaken, at least in my view. So those would be my two worries, like whether or not this makes any headway in our kind of abductive theorizing. Like, okay, sure, maybe there's an explanation, but like without it being conspicuous, it's not really helpful to us theoreticians. And then I guess the second point was the companions and guilt point.
I mean, we're happy though, right, to have to sometimes just posit a nature, right? So you say, okay, well, there are electrons, what they have.
Some people are happy with it.
Right, are there laws and how they work? The scientist is agnostic on how laws work. They're agnostic about maybe what the metaphysics of the natures of electrons is, and you just say, okay, but we have good reason to think there is such a thing. If there were such a thing, if it had a certain nature, it would explain a lot, and then would pass on the mystery to philosophers who often don't have much that's helpful to say.
Before I'll just say one more thing on this, and I want to hear Josh's thoughts on this. But yeah, I get the pull of that response, but I just feel like the scientists aren't like making. So I'm worried about like it being a brute necessity specifically, Whereas with the scientists, these are like, they're appealing to like contingent things. They're going to say like, of course the laws are contingent, or something like that. Whereas if they were really saying like, and their theory was that it's necessary, I'm going to be like, oh my goodness, that's a pretty strong claim. And like, I think we should be resistant to brute necessities. Or at least as a rule of thumb. So I'm wondering if that's kind of a relative difference between.
What makes the nomicity of the laws is that seems a kind of mysterious posit.
Right, I do want to have Josh come in. So,
Well, I was actually just curious, Alex, what you think of the companions with guilt, like that. Would you be happy to say that, not just causal finitism is true, but you also can't have kind of infinite grounding scenarios or any of those?
I explore that in the book. I end up rejecting it. I feel with Joe that there are going to be cases where it's hard to deny that there is some kind of infinite grounding.
Somebody,
Just citing it this year, is if causal finitism is the case, does that give us an unmoved mover situation? Is that layback here, or is that?
I mean, that's one of the conclusions, right? It supports a Kalam type argument that there must be some. I mean, it just follows from causal finitism and the claim that there's at least one instance of causation, that there's one uncaused cause.
yeah, I mean, this is what I was wanting to say about what's at stake. So my favorite cosmological arguments are ones that leave open the infinite series. It's just this reason I have not had a lot strong interest in, investigating this. But if there's an additional reason to think that causal finitism is true, then you might have additional type of cosmological argument. I mean, Alex and I in our book Necessary Existence, we give an argument from an infinite regress. I don't know if you remember this. If there is an infinite regress, then there's reason to think that infinite regress is itself best explained in terms of some fundamental reality that has necessary existence, if the regress is infinite. So if you have a finite regress of contingent things, and the first contingent thing has a cause, then Du Bois' circularity, let's say its cause is not contingent. That's one argument. But you don't need that argument, right? So
could I transition to infinite lotteries? Is that okay with you guys?
Yeah.
I think there are potentially several issues here. So one is that it's not clear to me that causal finitism helps with infinite fair lotteries and these sorts of paradoxes. And I know you're aware of this criticism, Alex, because Daniel Rubio pushes it in his Phil review of your book. So sure, causal finitism may imply that countable infinite fair lotteries are impossible. But I think that the paradoxical elements of the stories don't really rely on the supposition that infinite causal chains are impossible. Instead, the paradox consists in the fact that we would be rationally required to do seemingly absurd things if there were infinite fair lotteries. And I think that's really what's paradoxical about these infinite fair lotteries, and it doesn't require assuming that infinite causal chains are impossible. Daniel Rubio likens the causal finitist solution to infinite fair lottery paradoxes to someone who tries to solve the St. Petersburg game by saying that it's impossible for anyone to have infinite amounts of money. And that just seems like the person is sort of missing the point of the paradox. Sure, maybe it's impossible to have an infinite store of money, but the point of the paradox is that, listen, if it were the case that someone had an infinite store of money to offer me, which is a proxy for an infinite store of utility, then I would be rationally required, given standard expected utility theory, of course, to suffer any finite cost to even play this silly game. I'm going to make very likely to make only a few bucks on it. So if there were such a game, that's what I would be rationally required to do, given our standard theories of rationality, and that's what's paradoxical. And we don't need to even assume that there could be such a game. And likewise, I think with the infinite lottery, again, we don't even need to assume that there could be such a lottery.
I think we do, because I just find completely unsurprising that in an impossible situation, if we were in some situation that is metaphysically impossible, reason might lead us astray, right? Thinking about that we're going to get very weird decision theoretic or epistemic or non-epistemic rationality results when we think about people who are imagining that something impossible is true. Like, what kind of decision should I make if I think the good is the bad, or if I think that I don't exist, or if I think that my decisions don't affect, have no impact on their outcomes. I mean, it's just all sorts of weird things are going to come up, and it just you think, like, we all are going to surely agree there's going to be some limits to our reasoning, and not being able to do well when you think an impossibility to be true. And so, yeah, okay, that's just a standard limit.
So would you be okay with someone like responding to the St. Petersburg game by saying like, there just can't be infinite money?
Yeah.
Really?
I think so. I mean, and that is in fact one of the responses to it. So that's it's not a metaphysical version of it, but the decision theoretic version is that Russell and Isaacs use St. Petersburg to argue that utilities have to be bounded, and hence you cannot have infinite utilities or unbounded utilities, which are what you need to run this. And that I'm not in agreement with them on that. I don't agree with that solution, but I think it is a solution, and it's not a bad one.
We had a question. Oh, I was wondering if you could explain or re-explain the infinite lottery situation.
Okay, so do you want to know which? So there's sort of two parts to the argument. The first part is that if you allow infinite causal chains, you can generate an infinite lottery by doing progressive shuffling maneuvers of some sort over an infinite time. That's the first part. And the second part is that when you have an infinite lottery, strange things happen. Namely, if you and I both, one of them is if you and I pick out numbers from the infinite lottery, I pick out a number, you pick out a number, sort of kind of wonder, well, how big is my number? It's probably going to be pretty big, right? On average, it'll be infinity, which is strange, but never mind that.
Okay. So the infinite lottery is like the deck of cards.
This is the deck of cards, right? And you pick out one, right? And you've got some number that's randomly chosen.
Okay.
So you expect it to be large, but then you think, but the other guy's is probably larger.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
And you could do shuffling in other ways. It doesn't have to be shuffling cards. You could be having like an infinite line with numbers, and every day of an infinite pass, you get randomly step left or right on that. And by now, surely you're kind of, in some sense, on a randomly chosen number out of infinitely many.
I was kind of curious to ask you, Joe, about kind of how you might apply. It's a different topic though than the lottery. How you might apply unsatisfiable error diagnosis to the construction of liar paradoxes. So let's imagine that we've never seen a liar sentence before, and we have because they've been constructed. But let's just imagine we have it. Could we still use recombination intuition to justify that it would be possible to combine letters and symbols in such a way that they express liar propositions, and then from there to infer that there's some setup that's impossible, some analysis of the liar that's impossible, rather than the recombination is impossible. Like, just to draw this up and make it concrete, like imagine somebody says, no, actually, that analysis of a liar is not impossible. Like the truth-making hypothesis I came up with, let's say they don't accept that. Instead, what they say is that, yeah, if you did construct a liar sentence, that would be impossible. It would be literally impossible to do that. And they can explain that possibility by the unsatisfied at the UPD. That's how they explain the impossibility. Because I'm kind of curious, like what you would think about that kind of reasoning, where you're using UPD to basically infer that you can't do certain recombinations, rather than use UPD together with the possibility of recombinations to infer instead that something else is impossible.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this case, we would just need to lay out the various different assumptions, right? Naive, unrestricted application of the T schema. P is true if and only if P. And, naive, unrestricted application of that, together with the possibility of there being certain inscriptions which ordinarily have certain meanings, together with the recombination principle, together with such and such, and yeah, when you combine all of that together, you'll get a contradiction.
Right.
I guess, are you asking about like, is there a plausible move according to which, or is there a plausible way that we can extend a kind of UPD style response to this case where we just say like, we've just gone wrong somewhere and we don't have to pick any particular aspect of the story to say that that's impossible. I'm seeking greater clarity on your question.
Yeah.
Can you maybe elaborate or say?
Maybe the sense that I get is that the UPD is sort of competition with causal finitism as an explanation. And maybe I'm thinking of another style argument where it's not that the causal finitism is an explanation, but rather that causal finitism is an implication of, and then you have a set of proofs.
So this is actually getting to, I think this is really good because it's getting to the way that I might actually want to reformulate the UPD. Remember, so I don't, because I only briefly said this, but like, if you recall from my opening statement, I basically said that, hey, there actually might be a way that I might want to reformulate and precisify the UPD. And it would be something along the lines of, it's a reject for any given substantive metaphysical hypothesis T, it's a rejection of the claim that if T were false, then there could be a Benardete paradox. So it would be a rejection of like, hey, if there could be, what I think you're gesturing towards, if there could be infinite causal chains, then you could have a Benardete paradox. Can't have a Benardete paradox, so you can't have infinite causal chains. Right. The UPD should just be understood as uniformly rejecting those sorts of claims in that first premise. It's substituting causal finitism for that first premise, substituting temporal finitism, substituting
interpretation of Liar T schema. I don't know, like to generate a structurally similar paradox, but in another domain.
Rejecting certain arguments against time travel.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, I think we should take these on a case-by-case basis and see how plausible they are. Are there other solutions which are like clearly more plausible? Is UPD actually simpler in that case? Does it have untoward consequences and whatnot? I mean, I actually am inclined towards it, like a deflationary approach in the case of time travel paradoxes. It is like exactly similar to the UPD. But maybe in other cases, like the Liar case, I mean, I have to see it like formulated a little bit more precisely.
Yeah.
But maybe in that case, I wouldn't be open to it because like, I mean, it's just like so obvious that
that you can recombine the spatial material.
well, not then that, but the recombination is just like irrelevant because like all you need is a single sentence that says, "Hey, I'm false" or something like that. So like, it doesn't matter if like the recombination is not even to the point.
In that case, you have to recombine shapes of words to form even a single sentence. There be multiple sentences.
So you would like a priori, I think. So suppose we don't have any copies. Suppose we don't have any of the mechanisms of a reference except sort of the kind that we have in the Gödel theorems, where you have to actually describe the sentences, right? And you think, and you conjecture, well, I could make a liar sentence if I could make a sentence that describes itself. And I say, I guess that I can't make a sentence that describes itself. That doesn't strike me like an unreasonable inference. Now, it's false. We have the diagonal lemma. It shows us how we can construct sentences that describe themselves. But if you didn't have that, I think prima facie you'd think, yeah, it's a reasonable thing to think you can't do that. Mm-hmm. Why? Because if you could do that, you would have a sentence that says that I'm false. It says of itself that I'm false. You'd have a sort of successful case of self-reference, which you can't, rule out in some other way.
Josh, if I could maybe push on your kind of the infinite liars thing. So it seemed, at least on his face, that you were trying to use this, and your tweet today indicated this. So we're citing, or your ex, what do we call it?
Post.
Your ex post today kind of indicated this, but it seemed to me that you were using infinite liar to like support causal finitism, or there not being able to be infinite causal chains. And I don't know, that seems mistaken to me, because it seems like there are like definitely not good parity arguments in the vicinity. So like instead of letting S be there has never been a true sentence, let it be there will never be a true sentence. And suppose that every day throughout the everlasting future, the sentence will continually come into existence, and we'll actually, ask, is any instance of that newly modified sentence true? And we get yes if and only if no. Should we be able to conclude that an everlasting future is impossible? Well, if we do, then that seems to be very, very bad. Likewise, we don't even need infinite causation in order to generate exactly similar paradoxes. Suppose that suppose that space is infinite in extent, and there's a particular direction, let's call it R, and suppose that sentences infinitely many sentences just come into existence, and they say, in the direction of R, it's beginningless. Infinitely many sentences stretched out beginninglessly in direction R, and each sentence says, of all the sentences in direction R, that, hey, none of the sentences in the direction R are of me are true. None of those are true. That's an infinite liar paradox. That's exactly the same sort of infinite liar paradox, but notice that there's no infinite causal linking here. There's nothing like that. Instead, we just have the exact same sort of structure, and yet, causal finitism is just clearly irrelevant to it, it seems to me.
So there's a few different cases. So first, absolutely you're right to point out that there's paradoxes of the infinite future that are connected to the structure of this argument, right? So the infinite liar case that I came up with, I'm thinking it has the same structure, basic structure, as the Grim Reaper case. And so there is, of course, this argument that if the Grim Reaper argument is problematic, then it's going to call into question infinite future. And there's various corresponding flies we could explore. We talked about these things. To the second, I'd have to focus on this more, because I'm not sure if there's really going to be a problem there, because the way that I'm thinking about it is that there are liar sentences that are problematic, and I have a diagnosis as to what the problem is. My question, and I think I just have to look more closely at it and think about it with you, is whether there is, once you apply my diagnosis of what's wrong with the liar sentence, whether there is still going to be a problem in the case that you described if there's not an infinite chain. And that's just a question. I have to really look at that. I'd like to just think more about that. Look at that.
Maybe one other question that I want to pose to Alex is returning back to the infinite liars. Is that okay? They're not infinite liars, sorry, infinite lotteries. My goodness. Okay, so I'm just wondering if there are like parodies here that are very unattractive. So like, the sorts of parodies that I'm thinking of are like endless future parodies, infinite space parodies, infinitely many spatio-temporally disconnected universe parodies, continuous and dense space parodies, and continuous and dense time parodies. So an infinite fair lottery, of course, is a lottery which will certainly produce a unique natural number, providing each number with an equal probability of being selected as the unique winner. So hence it's a fair luck. Now, Rob Coons, and I believe you in your book, I think you guys argue that an infinite series of past indeterministic and independent coin tosses, numbered in reverse 1, 2, 3, and so on, can itself be a kind of infinite fair lottery. And specifically, consider the pattern of outcomes in which the tosses all produce tails except for a single heads. Now, Rob and Alex both argue that this result can be treated as an infinite fair lottery since each of the numbers had an equal chance of being selected as the unique correspondent to the single heads result. So we have, as it were, a kind of infinite fair lottery with whichever number corresponds to the single heads result. That's the winner. And with such a sequence of outcomes having transpired, we can ask like what a rational agent's credences would be that the winning ticket or the unique heads outcome would have a certain number. And here we get various violations of plausible principles of rationality. But like what I want to say, or at least what I'm leaning towards, is that like notice that this kind of infinite lottery needn't transpire throughout an infinite past. It could equally transpire throughout an endless future. Or infinite space. Imagine infinitely many spatially and causally disconnected flipping events, all of which are indeterministic and independent of the rest. There's still going to be determinate facts of the matter about which one landed heads out of the infinitely many. And it seems like that itself is going to involve an infinite fair lottery, no causal chains involved. Should we be inferring then that, space must be finite in extent? We could imagine that coins are in different spatially disconnected universes, infinitely many. Should we also infer that that's impossible? We can imagine that, again, like each day throughout endless future, a coin is flipped. Again, no infinite causal chains in this case. But again, it seems like we can get the infinite fair lottery if so long as there are determinate facts about the whole future in the present, because we just asked what the rational agent's credence would be, that which number
wait,
line to be.
we need the rational agent to be informed about the situation.
Okay, so suppose that God just reveals to the person.
Okay. The God case is difficult. But normally, right, so you would need to, the person would need to be informed that exactly one of these coins landed heads. The usual way for informing is causal. Something observes, depends on it. The God case is different because I happen to think that causation doesn't go through God, right? And you can generate pretty much many of these paradoxes. You can run them through God in a way that gives you parallels. I think what you have, I think the theist needs some kind of notion of quasi-causation, which I feel very embarrassed whenever I say it. And it's meant to sort of sound embarrassing. But I think we do, one needs a notion of quasi-causation where one effects things through God. So, for example, you pray for something and God gives it to you, right? Or we Catholics think that God has certain guarantees, right? That the priest says certain words with a certain intention, and bread turns into Jesus, right? And it has many similarities to causation. It supports counterfactuals in a similar kind of way. It can be it can involve intention can transfer across it, just like it can transfer across causation. The priest intends that there be Jesus present, and he says the words, right? You can have it's contingent, maybe, in the way some causation is, because if God didn't, promise to do it this way, it wouldn't happen this way. It's got a lot of things in common with causation, but I don't want to say it's causation for a strictly theological reason, which is that I think it would violate some kind of version of aseity to say that we can cause God to do something. If one's okay with saying that, then that's an easy way to handle this. You just say, no, actually you have causation going through God in all these cases where God informs you, and an ordinary causal finitism rules out these cases.
Yeah, I agree with that.
If you take on this further burden of saying causation cannot go through God, that God cannot be involved in causation, and that's, as far as I know, there's no dogma about this in the Catholic or the Orthodox Church, and therefore in no other large church, because all the Catholics and Orthodox really have dogma. It's so far not a dogma in the Orthodox Church that they have theologians in well, actually, even in the Catholic Church, we have common theologians, Eastern theologians, church fathers, who are happy to say that the Father causes the Son, though non-contingently so, and hence there seems to be some kind of causal relation inside God. Even if you say that, maybe you could still say that and still object to us causing something by God, but at least you're not saying God's completely out of the realm of being the target of causation. So, okay, that's one option, is you just say, okay, it's not dogma. Maybe you can have causation go through God. I find that that's my theological judgment, is that's not a good idea. And so I want to say, well, what we have is something very much like causation. Let's call it quasi-causation, and that we have quasi-causal finitism as well. Now, that is not very satisfying, that I don't know exactly what it is, what this quasi-causation is. But the reason I need it is for theological reasons, not that closely connected to causal finitism. It's introducing this notion is not, I'm not doing it ad hoc to solve any problems of causal finitism. I'm introducing it to solve problems internal to Christian theology, And if I didn't have the Christian theology, I wouldn't even feel I need it. I might just say, okay, we can you have causation that goes through God.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I just thought
And so this and that makes me, but it does sort of make me open to the idea, and more than open, actually, I suspect it is true that there is something a little bit more general than causal finitism. And it's not that every explanatory relation has finitism. It's not finitism, but every explanatory relation, because I'm with you on some of the grounding cases. But I think there is something, and I think that's a matter for further research, what it is. And I have two cases of it, I think, causation and quasi-causation. I think there may be more.
yeah. I mean, do you think it's at least
There might be compositional causation, compositional finitism. I sort of play with it at times. I think that might be true. I don't have any good paradoxes, so that would push me towards it. I don't have good reason to think it, but I sometimes feel this feeling, yeah, maybe you can't have an infinite object, like made of infinitely many parts.
Yeah, do you think it's at least odd or like weird or strange or implausible that like we would be solving, in the case where we're imagining God as his knowledge is, as it were, caused by the relevant events, the relevant Noid flips, do you think it's odd that we would be solving this kind of infinite lottery paradox in that case by appeal to causal finitism? But in the case of, let's say, God's knowledge being non-causally but explanatorily dependent on it, we would be appealing to something different. I mean, that seems really odd. It seems like there should be some sort of unified.
Well, here's the one reason to think, look, quasi-causation, whatever, if there is such a thing as quasi-causation, it's very similar to causation. It has many formal features in common with it, and it's, I think, more similar to it than the grounding and things like that. So then you think, okay, so maybe, the analogy, right? It's like that in these ways. It's probably like that in the finitist way.
But then if we suppose that God's knowledge is in fact instead grounded in it, it seems like
Yeah.
it's just so weird that we'd have to object to that scenario by saying, like, oh no, God's relation is like grounding. No, instead God would have to be different.
Well, but you can't say that God, but the question isn't just about God's knowledge, right? It's about God's us being informed by God. So that it's a relation between the future dice tosses or coin tosses and God's telling us something. And God's telling us something. Nobody thinks that's grounded in the future coin tosses. So the connection between the future coin tosses and God's telling us something is like the connection between somebody praying and getting the result of it, or baptism happening and grace being conferred, or something like that. And those seem like all very much, not very much, but somewhat at least unlike grounding.
Yeah, so there's one causal arrow from God to us. And there are infinitely many grounding arrows from each of the future coin tosses to God's state of knowledge. So I don't see where there's any, in this situation. So for the audience, like for you guys, like what I'm trying to get at is, let's just make stipulations about how God's knowledge relates to the world. Let's suppose that it's grounding. So that the relevant facts that God knows ground God's knowledge of them instead of causing God to have the relevant kind of knowledge. And they ground God's knowledge. God informs the person about which of the infinite many coins landed heads, the unique heads toss. In that case, it seems to me that we don't have any infinite causal chain, and we also don't have any infinite causal cooperation. We also don't have any infinite quasi-causal chain, and we also don't have any infinite quasi-causal cooperation. And yet, it seems to me that even in that sort of situation, we should be solving these infinite lottery paradoxes in the same way that we solve it if we suppose that it was instead causation or quasi-causation. But you wouldn't be able to say that if your ultimate diagnosis of this case, of where it goes wrong, is causal or quasi-causal finitism. So I think that there should be a unified treatment between these cases, but it just seems like we can't have it.
So this is very speculative, and there may be counter examples. I just thought of this possibility, but suppose you say this: if A grounds B, and B causes C, then A causes C.
Can you say that again?
If A grounds B and B causes C, then A causes C. In fact, A more fundamentally causes C, because whatever causal oomph there is in B is found in A. So if God's knowledge causes God's announcement, and something external causes God's knowledge, then there's something external causes.
Or grabs that knowledge, then that doesn't have to be a cause.
Yeah. Because you don't get I mean, I guess maybe there we have a difference of pictures of grounding, but my pictures that the grounded stuff, the things that are grounded are really fully grounded are almost not really there.
They're hardly anything over it.
They're hardly anything above, right? And in particular, they don't have causal oomph that they don't get from that they don't get from their grounds. But I think at this point maybe we should soon start opening it up to the audience, because this is getting very much an in discussion.